Welcome. We're going to kick off fairly shortly. For those that don't know, I am Stephanie Slater and I'm founder and chief executive at School Food Matters, and I'm supporting this webinar series that has been organised by Chefs in Schools, and I'm going to hand you over to Naomi in a second. But first to say, we're expecting over 100 participants today. Probably for your viewing pleasure, it's probably better to go to Speaker View, otherwise you're going to have 150 pages and thumbnails of people's faces. We have a series of speakers. They've all got 10 minutes, and we're going to have really just a minute or two after each of the speakers if you've got any questions you want to ask. But there is a Q&A at the end of this session for more conversation. I'm going to keep us to time so that we all finish on time, because I know how busy everybody is. We're going to play with the agenda according to one of our speakers is having trouble getting in, so we might play fast and loose with the agenda, but let's see how we go. So I'm just going to hand you over to Naomi.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name's Naomi. I run Chefs in Schools along with Nicole Pisani. We're a charity. We were formed about 3 years ago, and our mission is to improve kids' health through improving school food and food education. And a really key thing for us in terms of how you do that is by everybody who works in the school food sector getting together and sharing best practice. And so that's really what today is about. We're looking specifically today at the issue of quality and stigma associated with free school meals. I'm sure everybody on this call saw lots of really bad press earlier in the year about free school meals, but we do know that there's a lot of good going on out there as well. So today we really want to kind of have a look at the issue in more detail, and then also go through some of the solutions there might be. I will say though, I don't think anybody on this call would claim that they have all of the answers, so we would really encourage you to make liberal use of the chat function. If you've got any questions for the speakers, Christina's in now, fantastic. If you've got any questions for our wonderful speakers today, but also equally if you've got any ideas that you wanted to share, that would be really helpful as well. So without wanting to kind of go on forever then, we are going to jump over to our first speaker. Christina is the co-chair of the youth board for Bite Back 2030, a fantastic charity. I will let her sort of finish introducing herself properly. Over to you, Christina.
Hi everyone, sorry for the late appearance. My name is Christina. I am co-chair of the youth board at Bite Back 2030. And more generally, I'm an intersectional youth campaigner. One of the kind of proudest moments I've had at Bite Back is launching the free school meal campaign through a petition back in April, and it blew up. It has like 400,000 signatures, and that's what really kind of kickstarted my involvement in the free school meal space. So I want to start by talking about stigma. As a student, as someone that used to be on free school meals and is around people that have been on free school meals, I know firsthand and through friends what it's like to be on it, and the stigma associated with it. At school, it was really common for students to just skip lunches because they didn't want to say, like, you know, I'm on free school meals and food in the canteen has run out. One of our youth board members told us about how they have a fingerprint system at school, and whenever you walked in and you queued up, if you didn't have money on your fingerprint, you had to say in front of everyone, I'm on free school meals. And that's obviously a really embarrassing thing to do. So it often just leaves kids with skipping meals, and that is obviously atrocious. But it's also about when you're not satisfied with the lunch and the quality of meals you have, not being able to speak out because you feel like you're at a disadvantage already and you don't want to kind of put any more pressure on the people around you because you feel like you're a burden already. So yeah, eligibility generally matches recognized trends around surrounding regional deprivation and wealth, and race also plays a role. So a disproportionate number of Roma Gypsy, Bangladeshi, and Black pupils are eligible for free school meals. So real equality means making sure that every child, regardless of race or where they live, is able to enjoy a decent lunch at school. I live in a deprived area. I live in Lambeth, but I go to school in Westminster. So it's really obvious to me seeing the difference between the students that live in wealthier areas versus the students that live in areas like me, like mine, and how we're treated differently and the kind of impact that our area has on the food that we eat and our socioeconomic background. Like, why is it that, you know, the wealth of my parents has something to do with what I eat at school? And it's really unfair. And the fact that kids are being silenced through that is horrendous. We also need to look closely at why these inequalities exist. The reasons go much further than school food, but the systematic failures are all interconnected. We need to challenge ourselves and think about how racial and socioeconomic inequality is reflected in school food, and how access to quality, nutritious food can help bridge equality gaps. So we all know that free school meals is directly related to attainment at school. And if, you know, those that are on free school meals aren't able to get nutritious food, that directly impacts how well we do at school, directly. And that will disproportionately affect those people from minority communities, which is why it's so important that if we really care about equality and, you know, equal opportunity for everyone, this has to be something that we fix. And yes, this is kind of like the surface issue, but there are so many underlying issues. When I was on BBC Radio 4's food programme with Nicole Pisani and Jeanette, we were talking about this and how important it is that we realise the issues around it, and that this is just a kind of drop in the ocean compared to what we have to fight, but it is still really important. Our job won't be done until every child has year-round access to a nutritious meal, equal opportunity to enjoy healthy, appealing and affordable food, and safe, judgment-free environments to eat in. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. That was really great. And what a way to kick off this webinar. We've got lots to think about, haven't we? So I have asked whether anybody has any questions for Christina in the chat. Nothing has come at the moment. So it just feels like maybe we can keep moving and listen to Jake, who has obviously taken on some of these issues. And maybe he can come up with some solutions. And then after that, we can regroup. And please keep those questions coming in the chat. So over to you, Jake.
Hi, everyone. I've got a little presentation, so I'm going to share my screen with you all now. There it is. And okay, so my name is Jake Barwood. I'm the head chef at the Tosridge Academy. We're a mixed secondary school in Barnet in North London. We have 683 students at our school, and nearly a third of them are on free school meals. We have a high proportion of students on pupil premium as well, around the 50% mark. So we have quite a high proportion of students that would be considered at some level of disadvantage financially, their families. So we're an in-house school. Is in our kitchen, myself and all the kitchen staff, which you can see in the pictures below. We're all employed directly by the school, which is not very common these days. And I'm associated with the charity Chefs in Schools, and we try and serve the most exciting, high quality meals for our students, always cooked from scratch. We'll focus on seasonality, taking inspiration sort of from food all over the world. So here's an example of our menu that we've had this week, and it might not seem that different from what you might see in schools all over the country, but like I say, we really focus on everything being cooked from scratch. We have one vegetarian day per week, so you can see the halloumi burgers. We have 2 hot options, as you can see, One being a slightly simpler option, which is sort of a pasta dish, or pasta, or potentially like a stir-fried rice or noodle or something like that. And we serve every plate of food with vegetables on the plate. We make bread daily. We offer free fruit to our students, and there's a salad bar that students can help themselves to. So we try and push the boundaries a little bit on the sort of food that we serve. You know, and I love hearing the feedback from our students. You know, when they're talking about, or when they say, you know, it's the first time they've tried pomegranate seeds, or, you know, asparagus, for example, that we had recently with our fish and chips, or the wild garlic that we put into a spinach and ricotta cannelloni with wild garlic in there. So we're trying to always sort of push the boundaries a little bit on food, and sort of focusing on proper food cooked from scratch, and sort of lots of vegetables, and, you know, lots of colour, and try and make it as appealing as possible, because I think it's a really important part of a child's education is, you know, the food that they eat at lunchtime, and so many kids are being let down by that, including lots of students, obviously, on preschool meals. So stigma in preschool meals, it's a massive deal. Obviously, I think that it very much depends on different schools and how they manage this. I think that some schools do a fantastic job on managing how children on preschool meals, and kind of being discreet, being careful about how these, you know, not obviously showing, like Christina just said, that somebody's on preschool meals or something like that. But it can be a really damaging experience for young people. So in preparation for this, I spoke to people around my school community and kind of external people, and just asked for some examples of kind of the stigma that people felt when they were at school around preschool meals. So I think one of them that made me think about when I was at school is that we used to love going out. We were allowed to leave school and go out to the shops, or, you know, fish and chip shop or whatever at lunchtime, which I appreciate is not necessarily always the healthiest thing. But obviously being on preschool meals meant that some students were, well, you're unable to go and spend that money on that. So that was some level of exclusion. Being on preschool meals, sometimes students would feel like they were singled out if they forgot their key card. They would have to tell a member of the canteen staff, and we all know how busy and kind of manic those environments can be sometimes, and those things can kind of get shouted around the room, which means that lots of other people have overheard. There's also examples of sort of, one example from primary school that I heard was about children that didn't have their money, or were on preschool meals, and would be left with sort of cheese and crackers, or food that's not really up to standard for them. And on school trips, children getting a kind of generic brown bag for their lunch, whereas other students would be taking a packed lunch from home, clearly showing that these students are on preschool meals. I've noticed, you know, that not all of the students at our school take up their preschool meals. So that's a clear example again of potentially students kind of putting this self-conscious, you know, they're feeling almost a paranoia on themselves, that they don't want to be kind of, you know, about accessing their preschool meals. So I think that there's a lot of work that leaders in schools need to do and think about, making sure that we're always, you know, thinking about this as top priority. I do think that schools generally, I think with help of technology, have been able to be more discreet about preschool meals, potentially. So, you know, an electronic till, for example, like we have at our school, a student can scan their finger or tell us a code, and we put that in, and it will just sort of say in a little bit at the top of the screen, preschool meal, and we therefore know that student's on preschool meal, and they're eligible for, at our school, £2.15 a day. So £2.15 would, at our school, would give that child a hot lunch option, which is £1.60, and then also with that, they could get a dessert option, which would be cake or fruit salad or maybe an apple crumble or something like that. And that would be their £2.15 allowance, or they could get a carton of drink and their hot lunch option for their free school meal allowance. I think it, as I said earlier, so my school, we have quite a high level of students on free school meals, and I feel that this would very much impact on how people view free school meals. So other things other people that I've spoken to have talked about maybe being at a school when they were on free school meals when there was a low percentage of people on free school meals at that school, and I think that really would make a big difference. And in general, I haven't seen lots. I don't think I've ever really seen examples of kind of clear exclusion or students being kind of, I haven't seen like overt examples of kind of stigma, but I think some of these things are often a bit more hidden than that. I do also appreciate that we would only take one negative example of something like that to completely change how that culture in our school. So I think that some really kind of key recommendations for secondary schools, which is the sort of school that I'm in, and how we deal with free school meals are the following. So I think firstly, when in September, when we get a big increase, when the Year 7 group come in, I think it's really important that students are very much kind of made, students and families are clearly kind of told what the prices are of things. There's a lot of, it's quite, it's funny when the Year 7s come in, because you get, there's lots more choice than there is at primary school, at secondary school. There might be drinks, there's sort of maybe snack options, things like this. And that's a really kind of, that's a point where we often hear about this stigma where a student might sort of grab themselves a bag of popcorn, a drink, a cake, and a meal, go up to the till and then be told to put these things back. So I think that this is a time when it's really important about kind of making clear that this is a meal deal, and a meal deal, and it doesn't have to be kind of labelled as a free school meal, but it's about a meal deal that is, here's your lunch for a free school meal allowance, which is £2.15. You're able to get a sandwich or a hot meal and a drink and a cake, or something like that, and making it very much people aware early on. And then other things that I've kind of thought about that are really important is making sure, going on that point, that prices are fair, so that students are able to get a drink or a snack alongside their meal, and not being kind of just pushed on these very particular options. I think that them having a little bit of autonomy and choice is also really important for them, because it's quite exciting for them to have these different choices. Another thing that I would really recommend in secondary schools is having free fruit. So we get fruit through the fruit and veg school scheme. So we pay about 10 pence for a piece of handheld fruit. So we have apples and bananas and oranges and pears and little portions of raisins and grapes and things like that dotted around the canteen. And these are all completely free for the students to have. And this is really important for all students, and it's a lovely thing to be able to offer to students. But it also means that there's like something sweet that students can have maybe in the morning at breakfast time. You can swap that dessert option, so it means that a student can have fruit with their hot meal and a drink, and kind of have all three of those options together. And I think that it's a kind of a no-brainer really for schools to be able to offer that. And the other recommendation is,
Jake, I'll just give you one more minute if that's okay, then we'll go.
Yep, that's fine. And it's just talking about drinks, because drinks are a problem in schools where some secondary schools have lots and lots of options for kind of fruit juices and things like this. And I think that we need to be careful about that, because sometimes students can spend a lot of money on their free school meal allowance, potentially, on drinks. and it's maybe limiting the choice, that you're only able to take one drink a day, which is in line with the school food standards anyway. So I think that's my final recommendation. Anyway, thank you.
Jake, thank you. If you could, I can probably stop sharing the screen now. Here we go. Yeah. I'll stop it so we can get back. Gotcha. Okay. So that means I can see the chat now. There's an enormous amount of activity in the chat. So thank you for all contributing. Christina, I'm going to bring you back in because we've got lots of questions for you. There is a question, a really good one actually, that came direct to me from somebody asking, as this participant was saying, as a recipient of free school meals, why on earth are we still calling it free school meals when it's not free, it's funded? So can we be cleverer at coming up with a name? I think I've heard you mention this before.
Yeah, it is a problem because that phrase in itself is so stigmatized. It just feels ugly nowadays. But the problem, I guess, is coming up with a good alternative. Like because it is kind of like you still have to kind of single them out in a way so that you can ensure that they are getting the provisions that they need and that you can ensure they are getting the support. But you have to do it in a positive way. So I don't have the answer to that, I'll be honest. I don't know what the alternative would be. But it's about talking to young people and finding out what they feel comfortable with, because often within this discussion, there aren't that many young people there. I think Fight Back is the first organisation where I've actually felt like young people are being listened to. So talk to us, we're here. That's my answer.
That's a really good answer. And I know that the Food Foundation have done some work with their ambassadors too, and we're trying to think of a more positive spin on it. So school food allowance, school food premium, all these things sound far more positive and don't suggest free. Thank you for that. So people have also been asking in the chat where in the country the ambassadors are. Are you all over the UK or is it, yes, tell us.
We're all based in England, but all over. So we've got loads in the north, loads in the south. And the thing for me is that no matter where we are, we still have the same experiences and we still have commonalities, especially with those that are on free school meals or that were on free school meals. So that proves to me that it's a national issue, because no matter where you're based, whether it's London or Birmingham or Manchester, you still experience the same things. Doesn't matter if your school's an academy or whatever, we still experience the same things. So that's the real issue. It's not based on whether you're in a rich area or a poor area. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And Jake, I just want you to know there were lots of comments about your delicious looking food in the chat. So there's lots of positive feedback on that. We've had a question about payment systems, because obviously that is a really positive way that we can anonymise free school meals registration, but Christina did point out that there has been a problem with that in the past. Jake, have you come across any problems with your payment system at Totteridge?
I think for us, I mean, it's a case of when we serve the students, as long as the computer is facing the server or the person on the till, then I think it's quite a good system that we have in place. So a student either puts their fingerprint or tells us a code, I'll input that, it will come up with their kind of profile or whatever, and it will have their free school meal quite discreetly written sort of on the top, and then also it will have kind of what their balance is on their account. So they get their £2.15 every day, plus if their parents, that you can top that up. So if they wanted to be able to top up an extra £1 every day or something like that to get an extra option, they would be able to do that. I find that it is it's a good way of doing it, and especially maybe some of the examples that I was of people I was speaking to before, when it was a cash system or a key or a kind of card system, that would even more kind of single somebody out as somebody on free school meal.
So just to address Christine's point about one of the experiences her ambassadors had, which is if there was a situation where the account didn't have enough money in it, if the person on the till saw that a child on free school meals had a balance that didn't cover it. How would you deal with that?
Well, they will always be able to get their meal, because the free school meal allowance, even if they were kind of overdrawn, so to speak, their free school meal allowance kind of overrides that every day. But we do have to send out, you know, we might say, I mean, we have to say to students sometimes, you're overdrawn, but we won't ever say your free school meals and you're overdrawn. But the school does have a policy that we shouldn't allow, or we shouldn't, you know, free school meals students, we need to prioritise to make sure they're not very much overdrawn. And often the school will, if that's the case, just sort of wipe that debt off. You see what I mean?
I think we'll be hearing a bit more about this later with one of our speakers, but it is complicated. And of course, we all know the answer is just to make them free to everybody. And then there'll be a problem. But that's a bit controversial at this point in the proceedings. Well, look, I thank you both. We'll come back to that in the Q&A. But so I'm going to hand over now to Mark Thompson, who's going to talk about Mandeville Primary School, where school meals have been extended to all pupils. Are you with us?
I am. Good afternoon, everyone.
Hi there.
So I've got a slideshow to share with you as well, so just bear with me while I get that up on the screen. So I'm hoping that you can all see.
Yep.
Brilliant. Okay, so my name is Mark Thompson. I am the Associate Head Teacher here at Mandeville Primary School. And like all of you who are here today, free school meals and the stigma attached is a huge concern for us here. And we worked hard to, hold on a second. Yeah, worked hard to manage that as an issue. Just a bit more background about the school. We're in the heart of East London, which in Hackney, and in an area of very high deprivation. So for us, the majority of our children are on free school meals. And within in our school particularly, our community mostly live in social housing, which means that whether our children are on free school meals or not, many of our families, or in fact, most of our families, struggle financially, or at least have financial challenges for many parts and aspects of their lives. So we find that the children in our school who are not on free school meals are the children of families who are in low paid, generally low skilled work and manual labour. So that in itself brings with it a range of issues. So in terms of that stigma, for many of our families, just the idea of receiving a free school meal, as Christina and Jake have alluded to already, that in and of itself is an issue. And dealing with that just as an issue on its own is huge. The social status and the feeling that people get when taking something for free, conversely to some ideas about families who are on free school meals, it's not something that our families want to do. And as a result, it can have a negative impact on children when we're trying to offer them something that we feel is good for them, but it's the way that it was offered was working. And that threshold for free school meal entitlement we found was also a problem. So we had children who were not entitled to free school meals, but also couldn't afford to pay for school meals because they were just over the threshold, so therefore didn't receive the funding. So we'd end up with families, instead of having the free school meal, they'd end up providing a packed lunch. And as a school, we are, like Jake's school, we are a chefs in school school. We're providing nutritious food and expanding children's food knowledge is at the core of what we do here as a school. So that obviously didn't fit well with us. And it's heartbreaking to see children come in to school with, I don't know, a jam sandwich, often just one slice of bread folded over in half, and possibly a packet of biscuits because that was a cheaper option than the school meal. And then also the challenge of challenging those families to say, we want you to provide your children with a healthy meal, knowing that those families couldn't afford it, which created obviously a moral dilemma for us as a school, and clearly was not fair. That also put the school in a difficult position because when we did have families who were on free school meals or who were just over the threshold and therefore paying for it, they would run up huge debts. So again, chasing down a family who've run up a huge debt, who we already know were in a challenging financial situation, didn't sit well with us as a school, but we had to follow through because auditors, outside influences would be asking us, what are we doing about it? So we would become the bailiffs or those people that having those challenging conversations when really what we wanted to do was help our families. So a lot of our work was around, okay, none of us are happy about this. The stigma's not right. It's not fair for the children. It's not what we want for our children. So how do we find the solution? So the maths series really simplified. I'm a primary school head teacher, so I'm going to keep it really simple. And I haven't done SATs for many years. So the key message here is that when we looked at what it cost to actually feed those children who are not entitled to free school meals within our school population, the cost versus the negative impact of those children coming in with insufficient and malnutritious, I suppose is the right term, food, we felt that we could afford to spend some of our budget, reallocate those funds to make sure that every child in the school, whether they're entitled to it or not, received free school meals. And for us, it just wasn't too much money for us to consider spending in our community as a community school. And just to kind of put that into perspective, for us, just the idea, schools, our budgets are directly linked to our roles. So the number of children the number of bottoms on seats impacts on the amount of money that the school has. But when we looked at the cost of feeding children and looked at how that fluctuation in the school roll, we compared the two, that £10,260, which would have cost to feed everybody else, is something that we might win or lose over the course of the year anyway. So for us, it was a no-brainer. Regardless of what the government decided to do, we decided free school meals was the way forward for every child in school. And as a leadership team, we work really hard to make sure that every meal is nutritious. For us, chasing debt really was not the way forward. The admin costs, for example, of chasing up families for the money that they owed, it just didn't balance out anyway. So all roads led to the answer that free school meals for everybody was the way forward. So in that sense, we addressed the issue of free school meals as a school for all of our children. And I suppose at that point we felt, okay, brilliant, we've tackled this issue, we've addressed it, and we've resolved it. But COVID-19, as it has done for the whole world in many, many different circumstances, just threw all that into a huge mess for us, because we suddenly had children who we were able to feed when they came into school. It was not so easy to do when they were working remotely, and not so easy to manage. So initially, we were able to, and were funded to feed free school meal children who were entitled to free school meals whilst they were working at home and working remotely. The biggest concern for us, alongside obviously their academic progress, which obviously as a school is key, but for us, the well-being of those children who are now not in our care, so we couldn't check in on them every day and make sure that they were doing well and learning as they were supposed to. Also, knowing that for many of our children, that nutritious meal that they need at least 3 times a day, at least guaranteed for one of those meals, was coming from us. So we'd need to provide that. So we set up what I can only describe as a huge restaurant, a factory, so that we could provide free school meals to those families who are at home. But then that then raised the stigma, because suddenly we're only providing free school meals for those families who are entitled to it. Along with that came the stigma, so we had a very low uptake. So again, we had to think about changing the model. And regardless of the funding that was coming into the school, we felt the right thing to do was make the free meals available for all families. And again, we tried to think carefully about how we worded it. You can imagine during the pandemic, at the forefront of our mind wasn't how we market the idea of free school meals for families. We were just thinking, get it out to them. But the marketing side of it, as Christina alluded to earlier on, how it's presented is huge. So We then just made the free school meals or the meals available to everybody, and found that by changing the way it was marketed to our families, then changed the uptake. All families being available to all families meant that the uptake doubled, more than doubled in fact, and we were therefore able to reach more of our community and make sure that children were fed appropriately during the lockdown. So ultimately, for us, and I've written all of this bit down because I just didn't want to miss any of it out, because, and I know you can read it, but I'll read it to you. Even though there are so many strong arguments for free school meals, for us, it has to be discussed at the highest level. I feel privileged to be in this here today talking about it with so many people who are clearly passionate about it, because there's more than just a stigma attached to free school meals. It's those families who are just over the threshold as well, who suffer as a result of the government or the powers that be not considering free meals for all children to be the way forward. If we can, we find enough money for other things that I feel are less worthy as a country. So I'm sure the budget can be adjusted to make sure that every child gets a nutritious meal and therefore isn't disadvantaged in the way that Jake and Christine have already alluded to. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope that
you, Mark.
useful.
Not only was that fascinating and inspiring, but also on time. So I'm very grateful to you for that. So we've got some, I'm going to stop sharing so that we can see each other. Ah, there we go. You've done it for me. Lots and lots of really, really positive responses to that. I'm just going to ask you one question that's come in, which I thought was interesting.
Sure.
Was with the free lunches, are any of the children still bringing packed lunch?
Okay, so the way that we've got around that, we've actually used the COVID restrictions to our advantage here. So one of the things that we've been trying to do is to phase packed lunches out, because mixed up into all of this is the idea that many of the families have that the meals that we're providing, which are even more nutritious, the meals that Jake described and displayed earlier on, present quite a huge change for some families. And for some, there's a rejection, and people wanted to stick to what we know to be unhealthy meals. So we had a small number of families who still felt that bringing in packed lunches was the right thing to do. And we set whilst we discouraged it, we also set a requirement for those lunches to be really healthy, and we managed that as discreetly as possible. And since the lockdown, because we've stopped children bringing in bags and unnecessary items, we've also phased out packed lunches. And almost by default, families have got on board. Those children who were reluctant before are now loving the meals because they didn't have a choice. And when we open back up properly, I'm not going to mention it. And if people do bring it up, I'm going to say, well, we're hoping that we'll just say no, and then they'll accept it.
That's really interesting. I've heard examples before of schools saying we are a school lunch school, and if you want to bring a packed lunch, you need to come and chat to me about it. So that often puts people off sitting down with their heads and having a conversation about it. So this is the moment we have an interlude. So with the hope technology is going to be kind to us. We've allowed 10 minutes for this. It can't be any longer, otherwise we're going to get in a pickle. So, and I know how creative Nicole is in the kitchen. So I'm going to hand over to Nicole, and hopefully this is all going to be seamless.
Hi.
Yeah. Yes, there she is.
Hi, Stephanie. Hopefully it is going to be seamless and in 10 minutes flat. So so I'm Nicole and this is Ollie. We've been working in school food for the last 6 years, and to be honest, it's the thing that we love doing the most, really. It's all about the food. So we have a dish which we actually created with the students at Totteridge Academy. We went into the classroom and asked the students what they'd like to see for snacks. And it was amazing, like the response that came out, with the different kind of dishes and the knowledge was amazing. So we did come up with this dish. It's a lamb kofta with a tahini dressing. I know sesame is always a bit of a problem with allergens in schools, but I think if you shy away from flavor, you'll end up, if you're afraid of allergens and you shy away of using certain ingredients, I actually think that you end up having food without any flavour. So Ollie's going to do the kofta bit, and I'm going to do the salad bit. Mine's the easy one. In the meantime, Ollie's actually going to give you a few tricks with lamb kofta.
Right, so we've got some minced lamb here, and so there's about 3 things that we want to kind of point out when making koftas. Quite a lot of the time, people might put egg into their koftas as a binding agent. It's not actually necessary. Like, the way to do it is you need, a bit like bread, you need the mincemeat, kind of just, with whatever, your hands, you can use a wooden spoon, whatever. You need it, and that generates it develops fat so that it actually binds and stays together. And what we do with the school food, especially, is we try and get as much nutrition into each dish as possible. So in this case, we've got smoked aubergine that we've a bit like a baba ganoush, but we've scooped out the flesh and it's inside the kofta, so it's actually part of the mix. And this helps with the nutrition, and it also helps keep it moist for quite a long time, actually. And one other thing is that when we're shaping koftas, we're shaping it to kind of like a bullet shape. So you want one side kind of thicker and one side pointier. A bit like this. Okay. And then it just goes straight into a pan. So we do that with each one. And this is quite interesting. Like, the reason why we worked with koftas and things like that when we were coming up with snack ideas for the Totteridge kids is, like, generally they're always left with just pizzas, or they have a certain expectation of what snack time should mean. And this is kind of showing that it doesn't always have to be pizzas. It doesn't always have to be something quite so heavy. It can be something light and healthy, even though it's really satisfying and actually seems like a treat because it's the kofta with tahini sauce and a nice salad. So I might get a little bit smoky for a second.
Also, I just wanted to add, I think obviously the webinar is about breaking the mold with snack food and also moving away from the stigma of preschool meals. And I think as chefs, I think automatically we always want to think outside the box. So when you tell us to give, when in general, if there's a bit of a challenge in coming up with food that's not veg, I think all of us took it on quite passionately. So I'm actually doing quite a simple salad. It's cucumber, tomato, spinach, and parsley. I'm just going to flip some lemon zest. So it's actually just using really good ingredients, because these are, it is quite simple food if you actually, know that colour. I think, with kids, it's all about colour as well.
Some of our greatest successes in the kitchen have actually come from kind of accidental creation. But one time, I think when we were working at Gayhurst together, fish delivery came really, really late. Didn't come until probably like about 15-20 minutes before service started. And one of the things we decided to do in that very short period of time was to bake the fish in a tomato sauce rather than breading it. And that was the first discovery that we can make something really colorful, really fresh, and really, kind of getting away from that. So it always has to be breaded. It always has to be battered. And the kids actually really responded very well. It's something quite out, kind of out there, but they did actually really respond to it. It's quite nice to see. Yep.
And also one last thing, I think, making delicious food, it kind of lets the food talk for itself. And, regardless who's, paying for it, I think at lunchtime, if you make food that looks hopefully like what we're going to make now, fingers crossed, 10 minutes flat, Stephanie. Hopefully, this is what gets the kids to eat the food and gets kids excited.
I don't know about the kids, it's getting me excited. I'm starving.
Now I'm going to do the last bit, the chefy chefy bit, which is just squeeze some lemon over everything.
And
tahini
final
dressing.
resort of tahini dressing,
Very,
which is 1/2 tahini, quarter lemon juice, quarter water. That's it.
very messy chopping board for anybody out there, I'm acknowledged. And this is a dish, and this is, you know, it's costed at 60p. It is, you know, it's colourful, it's fresh, and it's not bad.
Thank you.
Definitely.
That is super impressive. I'm just, as I say, I'm just sorry I can't dive in there and grab some. So I think that people on the call might be quite interested just about the costings of that. So when you serve, this is served in secondary school, is that right, Nicole?
It is, yes. I mean, what we're doing at the moment is we're coming up with a snack menu to each school. Each chef is actually allowed to come up with their own menu. But we create templates, so we create template recipes. So this is one of the template recipes we have on our Chefs Alliance. And yes, you know, any chef has access to it. But like I said in the beginning, I think the interesting thing was that we went into the classroom and asked the kids to come up with the menu themselves. So whenever we join a school, we say, I think this is a really good idea to actually get the kids to listen to what they want rather than create the menu ourselves. Obviously, as you know, you're always going to have the winning dishes or the dishes that they like the most, which are, you know, as we know, the pizza. But we also do pizza with a spelt flour, which is just easier for the body to digest, and you don't feel, after you've eaten it, you don't feel drowsy, which is what we all feel when we have too much gluten. So yes, back to your question, Stephanie, it is something that we recommend to do. But I'm not sure. I mean, Jake, I know that Jake was on. This is the dish that we came up with for his school. But
and apparently his year 11 class loved it. He's just put in the chat. So, and just another question. We're being asked whether you're happy to share the recipe, please, because obviously it's great if you can share these ideas.
Definitely. That's the easiest thing, is sharing the recipe.
Fantastic. The other thing that has been asked in the chat, just as a point of order, I know that this webinar is being recorded because lots of people are asking if all of the good things we're learning today will be available afterwards. So I can't see Naomi, but I'm sure she's madly nodding to make sure that all of our participants can sit down and watch this again and pick up some of the great tips you're presenting.
If there's any school head teachers, go to our website. I think Naomi will be grinning now. But yes, we love to work with schools, and we love that kids are eating this food.
And much support for the idea of chefs, school cooks, catering teams talking to their customers and hearing what they want. So I think everybody on this call agrees with that. Thank you both, and thank you for keeping to time, because now we're going to hand over to Zoe. Zoe McIntyre, Children's Right to Food Project Manager at the Food Foundation. So Zoe, are you with us?
Hello, thanks Stephanie.
Welcome.
I also have some slides, so I'll just try and share my screen. Just 1 second. I realise I'm on the countdown, so I've probably got 9 3/4 minutes now. Right, here we go. So I think some of the points have already been made by some of the speakers that I was going to talk about, so I'll try and skip through those that we've already discussed and just give a little bit of background, first of all, about the campaigning that we've been doing specifically at the Food Foundation with young people around children's food, and particularly free school meals. So just a bit of background in terms of how this all started. In 2019, the Food Foundation undertook a year-long investigation into children's food, and particularly looking at health inequalities and food insecurity, not just in schools, but also at home, outside, and kind of their food environments in and out of school, really. And this involved talking to hundreds of young people, pupils, but also teachers, experts, academics, caterers, you name it. And this all kind of came together in a report called the Children's Future Food Inquiry, which was published in 2019. At the same time, kind of recommendations that came out of that inquiry that were really driven by the young people that we'd spoken to were kind of formulated into what we call the Children's Right to Food Charter, which has actually been updated since 2019 during COVID to kind of reflect the situation as it stands. You can see an illustration of this on the right, and I'll go through some of the asks a little bit later on, but really it's a kind of signposting to a lot of the time central government in terms of the possible recommendations and improvements that can be done in school and out of school to really allow all children to have access to a nutritious, healthy diet all of the time. So a little bit like Right Bike Back, we also work with young people. This kind of started with our inquiry. We had a group of 14 young, who we call the young food ambassadors, who all had some experience of food insecurity of some form, lots of them obviously on free school meals or had been on free school meals, who then kind of came forward and were willing to talk about their experiences more publicly and kind of drive that personal experience into their campaigning. And since then, we've been expanding this group. We now have kind of around 24, I think, young food ambassadors across the UK who have been really active and kind of come out of their, have been quite embarrassed about talking about their experiences, to now really being quite kind of forceful, impressive campaigners in their own right. And obviously during COVID, this has been hugely important, and we've been involved in lots of different areas of the kind of free school meal debate, particularly working with Marcus Rashford. So you'll see a few stories that have been shared by our young food ambassadors on his in his social media and in his campaigning, working with on his petition that got 1 million signatures. But also the young food ambassadors have been meeting a lot with government, such as Vicky Ford, Children's Minister there on the left, to talk about their experiences and also put forward the recommendations of their charter. So I'm sure we've already discussed and you all know why this matters, but I just wanted to kind of draw attention to a few bits. Obviously this week we know that we've heard that the school, the kind of free school meal count across England released by DFE has gone up hugely. We kind of already expected it, but the official figures have come out. And this on the left kind of shows the food insecurity tracking that we've been doing as an organisation at Food Foundation to look at the kind of levels of food insecurity across households with children throughout the pandemic, which has obviously been huge and has been kind of hugely exacerbated by the multiple facets of what the kind of pandemic has thrown up. And then just on the left at the bottom, we've also it's just a few quotes from some of the kind of more qualitative analysis that we've been doing throughout the pandemic to hear from young people about their worries and concerns, which obviously a lot of which are around not having enough food at home, watching their parents go hungry, and that kind of situation. So in terms of what our charter involves and kind of how this is relevant to schools and caterers, I guess firstly I'd say that some of the asks across these kind of 5 different areas are not only in schools but also kind of revolve around junk food advertising, or kind of top level. Setting up a commission is one of our key asks, which is obviously directed at governments not only in England but also kind of a joint effort across the UK. But there are some key areas, particularly in the kind of areas of stigma, that I think schools could possibly have a brilliant impact in moving forward on them. So some of these issues have already been raised, and obviously it's good proof that it's not just us who are kind of hearing from young people about this, but it's the kind of problems across the board. So the issue of free school meals and the negative connotations of the name was one of the key recommendations that was put forward by the young people. So they kind of came up with the idea of a school food allowance. Obviously there's different ways that schools might want to think about how to refer to free school meals, but school food allowance is something that we've been talking about. Poverty proofing of schools. A lot of young people and pupils kind of talk to us about the fact that they often missed out on different areas because they didn't have enough money. So this might be kind of having money for cooking classes, or different areas that they kind of felt like they couldn't kind of be included in because they didn't want to talk about the fact they didn't have enough money to contribute. And also kind of protecting the anonymity of children on free school meals, which has already been discussed. as to Jake's point, the kind of the fruit and veg scheme is obviously brilliant, is available to some kids but not available to all, so it's kind of making sure that all children can have access to fruit and veg for free is a brilliant way to help those that wouldn't necessarily have it at home or can't necessarily afford it, because we know that that unhealthy food is often cheaper than healthy food, to have access. And one of the other areas that I think we have touched on, but is something that our young food ambassadors feel quite strongly about, is the idea of not having to pay for water. We know that the school food standards stipulates that there should be tap water available in all schools, but obviously it doesn't always happen, and having a kind of no plastic bottle, no water bottle being sold on the premises, or kind of going water only, definitely things to consider. And I think that our young people would be really kind of advocating for that, and have spoken to government about that on a number of occasions. I think that the other area that I would just like to talk about quickly is just the food education here. So obviously we know that food education is happening and from a variety of different ways across schools, but kind of thinking more about how to incorporate the learnings and kind of stigma attached to food poverty and free school meals, and how that can kind of be part of the curriculum, I think is an interesting thing to think about. We know that there's so many more children who are coming back to school on free school meals who might have never been in that situation before, so it's a really ripe time to be able to try and talk to young people about their experiences, or about the kind of ideas around and the issues around food poverty, and using Marcus Rashford as an example of that, of the kind of ways that we can speak about people's own experiences and it not be stigmatizing. I think there's opportunities there to think about how to do that creatively and with young people in mind. The other thing I just wanted to talk about, we have heard lots of good ways of involving young people in decision making. We do it and try and kind of try and put their voices forward at the top level, but I think across schools it's really important too. One of the things that I've noticed quite on a number of occasions when we're speaking to DFE and the young people are speaking to DFE with us, is that officials often say, oh, well, that's an issue that you should speak to your school about, or you should speak to your caterer about, or you should speak to your school governor about. But the young people often say to me, it's really difficult because we don't want to feel like we're troublemakers. We don't want to feel like we are causing a fuss. We don't even know who our school governor is, and whether they were responsible for school food, or even if they know that they are. And we don't really know our caterers. So I think kind of be able to create a way for young people to be feeding into their school food menus or their eating environments, asking their opinions, asking them to test out school menus. We've heard some great examples of how this is already happening, but kind of getting young people excited about the food they're eating, learning more about school food standards, and kind of investing in the food that's being served in the canteen would obviously be great, also for uptake. So yeah, that was one of the things, number 3, that I just wanted to highlight from the charter as well. And just quickly, just to say that there's lots of tools for young people to become food activists, not only in the school environment, but kind of on a wider level. I'm happy to share this with Naomi, and she can share that perhaps if anyone's interested, but some of the tools that perhaps would be good ways of kind of starting that conversation would be our Right to Food podcast. So we've done 3 series now of podcasts hearing from young people about their experiences of food insecurity, talked about free school meals, food banks, you've named it. We've got a campaign film, which might be kind of a good way of starting that conversation off as well, which is just 6 minutes, but hears from young people and is in a school setting. And then I think that we're always looking for new ambassadors who are interested and passionate about changing school food and changing their food environments. But obviously, if there's areas in schools that young people can kind of come together and form groups and campaign in their own right and be encouraged and given space to do that, I think is hugely important. So that's it from me, and I hope that I've been in time.
Thank you, Zoe, that's really, really helpful. And I hope that you're going to stick around, because there will be a Q&A at the end,
I will.
which Christina is going to chair for us. So looking for more good ideas, we're now going to Darlington, get us out of London, up north. I'm really pleased that we've been able to persuade Moira Regan from Bishop Hogarth in Darlington to come and talk to us about the work they've been doing around free school meal allowance and how they make sure that stays with the child. So Moira, thank you for coming, and over to you.
Mute. Okay, so if I can just say to people, I'm just going to concentrate on what's been described as the Just Change campaign, because we can all talk about the disadvantages that apply to children when they've got free school meals, and when the stigma that's attached to it, etc., etc. One of the things that was supposed to end that stigma was a biometric system. Whereby secondary schools will use that biometric system. So it's a thumbprint, it goes on to the child uses the thumbprint on when they're accessing their food and the till. And so there is technically no stigma, because no one knows that a child's got a free school meal or not with that biometric system. However, there is an issue, and therefore in conjunction with Citizens UK, the Tyne and Weir group, we talked to children about what the possible downfalls were. This is the basic downfall, and that is that each child that's on free school meals is entitled to an allowance each day. However, at the end of the day, that allowance is taken away from them, and the whole cycle starts again the next day, and they get a new allowance, and then it finishes at the end of the school day, and then it goes on and so forth. So when we talk to the children, there are a few issues with that. So the first is that what actually happens is that children, we find, that are on free school meals tend to spend less than their allowance for fear of going over. Exactly what Jake said there about they become afraid that they go over and then they're in debt, so to speak. So they often spend less. The other thing is that we found that if a child is actually doing activity at lunchtime or after school or whatever, then they don't get in for the lunch, and that's actually lost again. Or if they're off school for a particular reason, then they simply don't get the lunch. So you think, well, okay, what's that got to do with the price of eggs? Well, it has a lot to do with it in the sense that means that the children that are on free school meals do not have the same control over their funding as any other child. So, for example, a parent of a child can put £10 on the biometric system at the beginning of the week, and if the child doesn't spend it, it rolls over, and it rolls over until they've spent it. This way, and in some schools, children were only able to spend their free school meal allowance at lunchtime. So if a child needed something at break time or after school or breakfast club, they weren't able to access that. Now, that wasn't the case with our schools, but nonetheless, we still had a situation whereby the money was lost at the end of each day. With a slight change of the biometric system, which cost us £250, we were able to actually have that allowance rolled over so that any unspent funding could be rolled over until such time that the child needed to spend it. In the first year of actually introducing that system, £17,000 or more was spent by children that could access free school meals in one school. So in other words, those children were benefiting £17,000 more approximately by actually being able to roll that funding over on a daily, weekly basis. It's been calculated by the Citizens UK that equates to about £65 million is diverted away from children at the end of the school day because they've not actually, in a year, because they don't actually use their whole allowance. When we looked into it, we said, well, okay, so what happens to the money? Well, if you're actually caterers like ourselves, we do our own in-house catering, at least that £17,000 was going back into the school system. So hopefully those children did benefit in some way. If, however, you were had external providers, that went to the external provider. So then we talked to some external providers in the Northeast, and they said, well, that's how we are able to run the system. And we said, well, that can't be right. You can't run a system that is actually propped up by the money that should be entitled to our free school meal children. However, we haven't got very far with the external providers, and neither have we got very far with some of the local authorities, because, controversially, I have to be careful what I say here. However, local authorities usually benefit by giving the contract to external providers, and therefore they get something as a result of doing so. Now, you know, UNESCO actually says, UNICEF actually, sorry, says that 1 in 5 children in the UK are food insecure. And yet we actually have this situation whereby something like 745,000 secondary school children actually are disadvantaged potentially in this way. So about 20% of pupils don't take up their free school meal offer on a particular given day. What it does means it stigmatizes children, but it's even worse than that, because it actually means that if a child needs to eat, they can't do sport, because they need to get into the dining room to have their food. They can't do extra classes because they need to get into the dining room to eat their food, or they can't engage in any kind of extracurricular activity of any sort. And then if they're off for a particular reason, they then can't access that money either. And as I say, in some schools, they can't actually get anything before or after school. It can only happen at lunchtime. So in 2018, actually, I decided that every school in our trust, and we have 5 secondary schools in our trust of 26, they would all go to this system. So every child now in our secondary schools that is entitled to free school meals has that rollover position, so that at any point in time, if they don't spend their allocation, it gets rolled over to the next day and the next day. Now, it's not infinitum. We do it on a termly basis, because, you know, you could kind of create real massive log jams if you actually did it ad infinitum. So, you know, usually things are cleared at the end of a term. But the reality is that those children have access to what is rightfully theirs. And I find it incredible, because it's not our money. And yet when we approach people, and certainly I've spoken to the DFE about it, well, they're very reluctant to change, probably because of the way that the system props up so many other things. So when people actually argue that, you know, children are given money for their free school meals, and free school meals they're entitled to, some people's response is simply, well, they're only entitled to that free school meal on that given day. Don't take it on the day, don't take it at that time, therefore they lose that entitlement, which strikes me as grossly unfair in a world in which we are attempting to make sure that our children don't go hungry, and where our children actually need to be fed if they're actually going to have a greater access to academic prowess, and if they're able to engage in extracurricular activity. I saw one of the slides there that said, you know, I had to give up sport at lunchtime because it made me too hungry. And yet we prop up a system that actually doesn't give them the opportunity to do sport at lunchtime, because if they're doing sport at lunchtime, they lose their meal.
Moira, I'm just going to pause there for a second and thank you for that incredible presentation and those insights. We've got a lot of comments in the chat, and one of the questions we're being asked is whether, with your tweak to the biometric system, your students can spend their free school meal allowance at any time during the day, so morning break. Okay, and breakfast presumably is in there too. Okay, that's encouraging. Just reflecting on it, why on earth isn't this happening everywhere? I mean, it just seems so logical, and it is it's something, in a way, I mean, we could do with policy, but in a way it could be done at a local level, and would have a massive benefit. I'm also asked here, so we're aware of this in the Northeast. Yeah, I mean, how can we help to get this happening everywhere?
Well, I mean, I think that the bottom line is people just have to get on board with it. I mean, they have, you know, if you've got internal caterings, it's easier, because the mechanism for local authorities, as I say, I don't mean to be damning of local authorities, but, you know, these catering companies, many catering companies, and some are very, very moral and have great standards, but others, they pay their staff less than the real living wage. They use this money to actually prop up their own existence, if you like. So can you imagine if there's a catering organisation that has a huge number of schools, just how much money is actually being fed back into their system in order to prop it up? Now, their argument would be, well, we can't run an efficient system if we don't have that money. And my argument is, then the system isn't efficient.
So on that note, there are a lot of us on this call who are talking now about the need for reform. I think COVID has taught us that the system is not working as it should be, and there are opportunities for perverse incentives in school food. Census Day, we know, isn't necessarily the best way of measuring this. And we need to start looking at actual take-up as opposed to Census Day take-up to get a real picture of what's needed in relation to funding. But that probably is it's a good opportunity now for us to break. We've got if you wouldn't mind staying with us, Maura. Christina, are you still with us?
Yeah, hello.
This is brilliant. This is when I get a break from chairing and you take over. And you could field some questions to our panelists. I think you've got an opening question, haven't you, that Naomi's given you?
Yeah, so I've actually got some questions for individuals that I'll start off with. So I guess, Naomi, I'll start with you, Steph and Naomi. Is school food enough of a priority in schools, especially in secondary schools? Someone made a reference of, you know, we're a school meal school. Do you think that everyone has to inhibit that role? And can they actually do that?
So I think for a lot of schools, school food is a priority, but it isn't for all schools. And I think head teachers have an incredibly difficult job because everything is a priority, right? And obviously education comes right at the top, and output and grades and things from that. And one of the questions I think we kind of all grapple with is, we as a charity feel really passionately that school food is kind of a really key part of education, and it not only the food that we eat affects how, you know, learning outcomes and behaviours, but also it's an opportunity to educate kids about different kinds of foods. So I'm not sure that I kind of have the neat answer to how we do that, and I think there are probably policy levers that need to be pulled at the top, as well as all these brilliant head teachers who are doing really, really powerful and important things that other people can follow the lead. But I would say that no, I don't think in all schools it gets the priority. And I think that part of the reason for that is sometimes it can feel like a problem that can't be tackled. So one of the things we want to do with this webinar series is kind of demonstrate that actually there are schools out there doing really great school food, who are really engaging with it, kids are engaging with it, kids are eating great things, and it's possible to do that and give it that priority.
Completely agree. Thank you, Naomi. Has anyone else got anything to contribute with that?
Now I've taken my chair hat off. I think it's the answer to the question simply is no, not enough schools prioritise it. I think we all agree on that, which is a terrible shame, but for many, many good reasons why it slips down the agenda. However, I am a firm believer in having a little bit of stick as well as carrot. There's lots and lots of stuff that can be happening at a local level. I mean, Maura's just given us the most brilliant example. But also, I think there needs to be some accountability mechanism within schools. I think governors need to be reporting on this. There aren't, I'm a school governor, and it's very hard to get any agenda time to talk about school food. And I think that part of the problem is governors and schools aren't being asked any questions from DFE about school food, how they're spending that money. There is no transparency in this system whatsoever. And school business managers have told us that they would really appreciate some clarity around funding so they actually have a clear line to report on. So I think that would be a great start.
Yeah, completely. One of our youth members at Bite Back told us that the full free school meal allowance was not being used. So she only had £2.10 of the £2.30 that was allocated to free school meals. And we got her to kind of dig a little deeper, and she actually spoke up about it. She spoke up about it at her school because she felt empowered to, and she managed to make the change. So she's now given the full £2.30 at school. But then we thought, you know, maybe this is a problem that actually, you know, is in other schools. And we asked 30 different schools, and 4 of them don't appear to be giving the full £2.30 that every child, you know, deserves. So why is this the case, and is it ever justifiable? I'm gonna direct this at Mark.
This is that classic moment when you get caught checking a SLT text to push back a meeting and someone throws a question at you. So please ask that question again, Christina.
No worries, sorry for throwing it at you. I was just asking if not giving the full £2.30 allowance is ever justifiable, and why that might be the case.
Well, no, I can't see that it would ever be justifiable. In that we're a primary school, it works slightly differently, so the children don't go up and spend a certain amount. The meals are paid for, and then they are given what is considered to be a fair and appropriate amount, depending on their age, etc. So it's not an issue that necessarily comes up in primary school. So I'm hearing about that for the first time today, and I'm shocked, amazed that that is even happening. So most definitely something that eradicating that would have my full support.
I completely agree. Jake, what's one thing that all schools could be doing to make sure that the system is really working for all the children that are using it?
I think just having a really great kind of, firstly, you know, all the options that you have to your students for their lunch meal to be, you know, really excellent, like lots of fresh fruit and veg, you know, high quality, good food in every option that's available, making sure that all students are able to access, you know, even things like at our school we make sandwiches, making sure like the bread that we use is really good quality bread. You know, it's full of, you know, it's got lettuce and tomato and cucumber in with, you know, some chicken or whatever, you know, like even things like that, every option making sure that they are of the highest quality that we can do. And like I said, also being generous and offering things like fruit, having really good water fountains and facilities for kids to be able to have access, things like that. And I think that these things, it's not rocket science. These are just, you know, it's just trying to make sure that we can implement a system like this in all schools so that all children, independent of where, you know, their background or whatever, are able to access that stuff.
You spoke about fresh fruit earlier as well, and it is brilliant. I just remember when I was in secondary, the bowl of fruit was never touched, and it just felt like the apples and bananas had been there for ages.
You know, this is a great point, because this actually happened to us this week, that we had some pears, which obviously are more perishable fruit, that were looking kind of quite knackered, and you know, they didn't get touched for like 2 days. So we ended up taking them in and we turned them into a dessert. So we cooked them down and made them into a crumble. But then we got the fresh apples in and the fresh bananas in and put those out, and literally in one day, all of that kind of, it was supposed to last for like half the week went. So absolutely. So again, these things, it's about management, making sure that bowls are, you know, water fountains are looked after, fruit bowls are looked after, presentation of food is good. You know, always make sure that if you get another year group coming in after the first year group comes in or whatever, making sure that you've cleaned the side of the plate, of the trays, like you would a plate in a restaurant maybe, or, you know, re-put a new garnish on or whatever. Like, it's just trying to make sure that everybody gets the same treatment.
Yeah, completely agree. Maura, what would you say to those that might say that the kids could save up the money the allowance gets rolled over, they could just skip meals and save the money so they can spend loads on Friday, where it's fish and chips and get a drink and get a snack and that kind of stuff.
Oh, well, there's a couple of things you have to say to that. One of the beauties of the biometric system is you can actually track what children have to eat. So, our catering services would know very quickly if a child was actually not eating. We also have senior staff on duty all through the lunch hours, so they would notice very quickly if the child wasn't eating. So, there are those systems in place that actually, compensate for that and make sure that they do. You're right, fish and chips is the most popular on a Friday, but that's the only day they get chips, I have to say. But, it's not quite the same when they can't have salt and vinegar on it, though. So, but that's, that's nutrition for you. I'm just an oldie. So you do that. I think the other thing, if I wanted to say, I just wanted to make a comment on, is the other thing you have to bear in mind is that the sooner that you get rid of bottled water in selling to children in schools, the better. I mean, it's just a, it's a sin crying out, really. In more ways than one, because of the plastic, but also the expense and the markup that usually catering companies put on it, and a child that's on free school meals. Now you have to be careful, because you don't want to be so leveling that you kind of take away choice, because part of the education of a child is that they have to choose as well, because they have to choose according to what money they've got, what they're, etc. That there is an element there that we shouldn't kind of flatline everything, so there is no element of choice for everybody. But if you have your schools, and certainly our schools, children can have water all day, every day. And there are fountains throughout our schools, but more importantly, they can drink at any point water in a classroom. Can't drink anything else in the classroom, but they can drink water at any point in time in the classroom, and take it with, and so can the staff. So, staff can't have teas and coffees, can't stand that if anybody has schools like that. But the other thing is that we found is with in-house catering, I always got amazed, because we've got a number of primary schools. Obviously, we've got 26 schools, and 19 of them are primary. And, we had catering companies that talked about choice, and there was only one meal. So I would say, well, how's that choice? So they would talk about, the primary choice, the choice today is, well, the children had to take it or leave it. Well, I mean, again, that just defies logic for me. So all of our primary schools now have a choice. They have at least 2 choices each day. And Jake's right. The most important thing that you have to do in any catering situation is to make sure that the child that comes in last has exactly the same choice as the child that comes in first.
Thank you, Maura. I completely agree. And I very much relate to, coming in last, whether it be because you have something at lunch and literally having pasta and dry cheese, like it's horrible. So yeah, Zoe, one for you. Do you think there's been a reduction in stigma since Marcus Rashford spoke up? Have you seen that with any of your youth leaders?
Yeah, I think that the conversation's definitely changed, and obviously he's been a huge role model, sharing his own experience, but also using his influence to share others and speak up on others' behalf. And I think that there's kind of been a sense of, hey, it's not just me, it's not just my family, and those that kind of feel like they don't want to come forward and talk about it have that example being set for them. But of course, he although he's done a brilliant job, it's not going to solve the problem in itself, and there still needs to be work being done across schools and across catering organisations, across central government and local government, to be working on that. And I think that keeping that in mind and not seeing it as a problem solved, as we know, as I said before in my presentation, there's so many more families and children who are now struggling because of the pandemic, or others that have got a worsening situation than they did this time last year. And so there may be kind of steps that we've definitely taken forward in this conversation, but there's also a huge amount of work to be done. So yeah,
I completely agree, especially as a young person that kind of spoke up about free school meals. I have seen like loads of other people kind of step up and be like, hey, I was on free school meals too, but there is still that massive kind of push that's needed to make it completely normal, because it's not yet. Mark, another one for you. How do you feel about the transition of, you know, your students going from primary to secondary and kind of preparing them for the stigma that might come with them being on free school meals?
To be honest with you, it's not something I thought too much about. We do a lot of transition work, and after hearing you all speak today and realizing that their transition into secondary school is going to mean that they're faced with a situation that for them, they wouldn't have faced for a number of years, means that we'll have to do some transition work around that. And I would hope that we'll be able to work with their schools to make sure that they understand where our children are coming from and understand the message that's been shared here today, and therefore prepare those children for that transition and put things in place to ensure that they don't feel a level of stigma, because, as I've said, many of our children will go to secondary school and will still require free school meals. So it is a real concern for us, and yeah, we'll do as much as we can to address that, taking on board some of the ideas that have been shared today.
Thank you. And one last question that's open to, oh, sorry, you've got a hand up, go on.
Sorry, Christina, I was just going to say, I think lots of secondary schools do an induction for year sixes, a transition day, and they often do it in July and do it around some sport. And I know that I've always tried to encourage secondary schools to make a tour of the canteen part of that induction. How does it work? How does this thumbprint work? What will it look like? What will I be faced with? What queue do I stand in? It's really overwhelming to go from a primary school with up to 400 children, maybe fewer, to a school with 1,500, 2,000 kids. I mean, it is utterly overwhelming. So I think it would be great to see more secondary schools organising transition in that way.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, agree. That's a very innovative solution.
Christina, can I just go back on that? I think you're right about that, but I think the other thing as well is once they come to school in the secondary, it's not just about that initial transition, because it takes a year 7 a while to see whether they want a salad, whether they want pasta, whether they want roast beef and potatoes, you know, whatever that might be. So we always they always have an early lunch for at least a week, if not more, in our year 7s. So that they're out of the free-for-all of the rest of the year groups. So they get time, because it takes them time. Yeah, it takes them time, and that's when they don't spend their money properly either, because they just try and take something because they don't know what to do. So you have to give them time. It's got to be built into your day.
Christina, we've got 2 more minutes, and I want to leave 1 minute for Naomi. So maybe one more question.
Sure, it was one final open question. So COVID has exposed the enormous health inequalities in schools. What would you change instantly if you had a magic wand and could repair something about the system tomorrow? What would it be?
Change the eligibility threshold for free school meals to make sure that no children are missing out. I'd have to go for.
I'd make them free.
Yeah, me too. I will have free school meals for every child, and if that means a reduction in the child allowance, fine, but every child should have a free school meal.
I'm with you on that one, Maura. 100% free for all.
Yeah,
me too, definitely.
I think that's a clean sweep.
Yeah. I think we have consensus, and it's always good to finish a webinar with consensus. So let us not mess this up by asking any more questions. Can I hand over to Naomi just to close and reflect on the last 90 minutes?
Thank you, Stephanie. And just that a huge thank you to all of the speakers today. Some really, really interesting ideas. Thank you all so much for your time. And we'll let you get on with your after. And Stephanie, thank you for keeping us so neatly on time. Well done. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.